I am Patricia Schramm, the president of the American Swiss Foundation. Our mission is to connect and engage Swiss and American leaders through innovative programs. Many in our audience are familiar with our flagship annual Young Leaders Conference in Switzerland, and we also host more than a dozen events every year, bringing together the leaders of the two sister republics. Today, we are honored to bring to you a conversation with three wonderful alumni of the Young Leaders Conference. State Senator Chris Larson from Wisconsin of the class of 2015, the designated Speaker of the House of Florida, Chris Sprowls, class of 2019, and our moderator, the renowned journalist and political commentator, Amy Holmes, class of 2014. I look forward to a respectful and dignified discussion, shall we say Swiss style. Some of you have sent us questions for the speakers and they have been forwarded. At this time, I would suggest to our video audience that you choose the active speaker video view on the upper right side for the best viewing experience. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome the chairman of the American Swiss Foundation, Robert Giffra.
Thank you, Patricia, and it's great to be with you all today. I think we're actually having a presidential election in the United States, an election for our Congress. At least that's what best I can tell from reading the newspapers. I'm sure many of you got to see or heard about our recent presidential debate, and there were certainly fireworks during the debate. And assured by our speaker and our moderator that we'll try to have a Swiss-style debate here today, and it will be quite interesting. Now, there's a couple of points I just thought I would make at the start. You know, there's no question that the perception is that Americans are divided more than ever, and I think that gets exacerbated by cable TV, the internet, and probably more than anything else, sort of geographical politics, in that we do tend to be divided into blue states and red states. And there's a lot of talk about changes in our system. People talk about doing away with the Electoral College. I don't think that's going to happen. There's been even discussion about expanding our Supreme Court in light of the recent nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. I think that would be a big lift. There's talk about even adding more states to the United States, such as Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. So these are very interesting times in the United States. My own view is that the discord is actually somewhat exaggerated by the press. It certainly exists, and it's probably more a function of the fact that our leaders don't need to compromise maybe as much as they did when you had Republicans from so-called blue states and Democrats from red states, particularly in the U.S. Senate. So to lead us off today, we have Amy Holmes. Amy is a highly respected journalist in the United States. She went to my alma mater, Princeton. She's been a guest host of The View, and she's co-hosted the Glenn Beck Show on Fox News. She's also appeared on the Bill Maher show on HBO. She worked for Senator Bill Frist of Tennessee when he was the Republican majority leader, and she will be our Chris Wallace today. Next up is Senator Chris Larson. He's a Democrat. He's from Wisconsin. Wisconsin is an important swing state. It's a state that the president won in the last election. And Chris has been in he won a primary in 2010. He's been in the Wisconsin Senate since then. He served as the Democratic leader in the 2013 to 14 term, and he is a marathoner. He's run 30 marathons, which is quite impressive, and his goal is to run a marathon in every state, and some of them, Hawaii would be fun. Alaska, a little tougher, unless you did it in the summertime. Next up is Chris Sprowls, who's soon to be the Speaker of the Florida House. Chris was born in New York City, where I'm from, but he moved down to Tampa Bay in Florida when he was young. And Florida, for folks, is now the third biggest U.S. state. California, Texas, Florida. New York used to be up in the top three, and we've dropped down as many New Yorkers have moved, like Chris's parents did, down to Florida because both the weather and they've got a very efficient government in Florida. Chris has been a state attorney. He's tried criminal cases. As a prosecutor. He is someone who is an up-and-coming star in Florida, and Florida has, really an outstanding governor, Ron DeSantis, who is someone who I think could easily be running for president in another 4 to 8 years. And it's really, one of the more interesting states in the United States. So we've got one speaker from Wisconsin, which is a key swing state, the middle of America, the Rust Belt, and then another Chris Sprowls, who's going to be the Speaker of the Florida Assembly and the Florida House. And Florida is really that is probably ground zero in this election. If Donald Trump doesn't win Florida, Joe Biden will almost certainly be the president. So I very much look forward to this debate, and I suspect it will be more Swiss style than the debate that we saw on Monday night. So thank you all for being here, and it's a real privilege to introduce Amy.
Greetings. Thank you, Bob, for that great introduction. And yes, Patricia, she told us, directed us to have a Swiss-style, congenial, convivial, collegial conversation. So absolutely nothing like what we saw Tuesday night in Cleveland, Ohio, between President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. And with that, I want to lead the discussion. Chris, what were your reactions to the debate Tuesday night? What did you think? Chris from Wisconsin, you're there, swing state, ground zero. What was your view?
Yeah, most of the people that I heard reactions from while they were watching it, just a rolling timeline of people logging off or shutting it off out of just sheer frustration with the president acting more like a heckler than as the president, where he was intervening, where he couldn't answer any question directly, and further wouldn't allow Joe Biden to answer any of the questions. So, I don't know how much it changes people's minds, other than it reinforces where people are at in looking for answers from the president and not really having them. People here in Wisconsin are grappling with high unemployment. We have records set 4 times in the last 2 weeks in terms of coronavirus cases, and now we've hit a peak in hospitalizations. And unfortunately, we saw a president who decided it was more appropriate to mock the other candidate for wearing a mask than to lead in asking the country to do what's necessary to get past this.
We're definitely going to get to the COVID issue, the COVID topic. It's a very hot one. But Chris Larson, what do you say to that there in Florida? That even a lot of Republicans, you had Ari Fleischer and others, Stephen Moore, former economic advisor to Donald Trump, saying he interrupted way too much. CBS News had a poll just that night that came out and found that the majority of people, 69%, said that the debate made them feel annoyed. What was your reaction?
Yeah, look, I don't think anybody watching the debate, really enjoyed themselves, in part because I wanted to hear more about, what the president's done in the last 4 years. I think he's got a great story to tell, and I would have liked to have had the opportunity to hear more about that. And I think the American people would have benefited from it. And I think, more specifics on the Joe Biden side of what exactly do you find fault, with the policies of the president who's done massive things that had never been done in the last 25 years, including things like tax reform that for 30 years hadn't been touched, opening up opportunities for children and families and minorities to go to the schools of their choice. I think that those would have been real conversations that are real wedge issues for the American people, where you have, those things like school choice that don't fall necessarily under clear ideological lines between Republicans and Democrats. Where I agree with Chris Larson, Senator Larson, is I don't think a lot of people watching that debate were swayed one way or the other. I mean, I think they probably came in with their mind made up. Watching their person, they probably didn't like what the other side had to say. and chances are they shut it off, pretty early. So, I'm not sure that it really moved anyone, given the format. But I think what you're going to find is the people who can be moved are going to be moved on issues like the opportunity for them to have more money in their pocket, or the opportunity for their child to go to the school of their choice, regardless of the neighborhood that they live in. And hopefully over the next 30 days, we're going to hear more about those issues.
So let me challenge you a little bit on that, Mr. Sprowls, and pardon me for calling you Larson, two Chris's.
No problem.
Gallup did a report a couple of years ago, and they, like both Chris's have pointed out, said debates generally don't move voters at the
Yeah, sure.
But Gallup said there are two exceptions to that. 1960, the famous debate between Nixon and Kennedy, and how that really influenced voters' perceptions of the candidate. And also 2000, where it was a squeaker, and in large part because of your state, Mr. Sprowls.
Yeah.
What people saw Tuesday night on the margins, could that make a difference, and could that hurt Trump when we're talking about literally just a percentage point or even less in those swing states that really matter?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think, the last one you mentioned was in 2000. Look, that's 20 years ago. The politics of the country have changed considerably over that period of time. I think politics, unfortunately, has become, a national sport for some people, or even worse, a national religion for others. So I think that division is probably stronger now than it's ever been before. And I think that certainly the kind of cage match style debate that we saw the other night is something that I think the American people now have kind of baked into the cake.
So I want to give our Swiss viewers a little bit of the lay of the land. realclearpolitics.com. It is the go-to website for political junkies like myself, and I'm sure both Chris's and Bob. And today they're looking at their polling average of the national polling. And Biden is doing very well. Biden is up 49.7% to Donald Trump's 43.1%. In the battleground states that Real Clear Politics identifies, that's Florida, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Arizona. Biden is leading Trump 48.6 to 45.1. Chris Larson, when you see those numbers, what does that tell you about the state of the race? Do you think it still, however, has room to get tighter?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's worth remembering that Trump lost 4 years ago the popular vote by 3 million votes. And so he has never peaked over 50% nationwide, but we don't have nationwide elections to decide. It is decided in little chunks through the Electoral College, which is why you're talking to me in Wisconsin and Representative Sprowls in Florida. And there's basically, it comes down to about 6, sometimes 7 states. And those are where the polls really matter. And if those things can tighten. So for us right now, it's 47-43, 47 Biden, 43 Trump. And that's pretty consistent. Trump hasn't peaked over 44% in the last 6 months here. And I think, he continues to rely on a base to support him. And he also is trying to muddy the waters in trying to dissuade other people from coming out and voting for Biden, which is why for him, he's trying to make it more of a choice than what it is, which is a referendum on his time in office over the last 4 years. So that those numbers may end up tightening, especially in states like ours, like the swing state of Wisconsin, where we are inundated with ads, where literally you can't open up a kid's YouTube without having an ad for Trump or Biden or one of the super PACs, the point where my kids can rehearse them. Yeah.
So I spared all of that. It's a heavily blue state, so nobody bothers spending money on campaign ads here. Chris Sprowls, again, similar to you, Florida in 2016, Trump won Florida by just 1.2%. I mean, Florida, it always comes down to Florida and hanging back in 2000. Do you see an uphill battle for Trump to be able to pull it out November 3rd?
Yeah. The president's going to win in Florida. And I want to give some context to that. So, the 1.2%. So especially our Swiss friends who are watching, they go, oh, my Lord, 1.2%, what a narrow margin. I think what's not given context there is President Trump's 1.2% victory in Florida was the largest statewide margin in modern political history. Our governor's race, our U.S. Senate races were decided in far more marginal victories than President Trump's. President Trump's was, a darn near blowout by Florida standards because we are a purple state. Our statewide elections are very narrow and very, very tight. So he actually had a significant advantage. And I'll take one more step at the polls, Amy. If you go back to 2016 and you were looking at polls here in the state of Florida, and you were a betting individual, you would have bet on Hillary Clinton to win because all of the polls had Hillary Clinton beating Donald Trump pretty handedly. And yet, again, President Trump comes in and wins the state by 112,000 votes statewide, which is, again, by our standards, a darn near blowout victory. And I think the president's going to repeat that or maybe even greater this time.
Yeah. So, Chris Larson, well, I should actually direct this to our Swiss viewers just to clarify for everybody. As you probably know, but I just want to make sure you do, U.S. presidential elections are not decided by the popular vote. They're decided by the Electoral College map, which came as a great disappointment and shock in 2016 to the Hillary Clinton team. But I want to press you, Chris Larson, on this issue, on this idea of popularity. Hillary Clinton's popular vote win in 2016 was actually less than meets the eye. She beat Donald Trump by 3 million votes, but she also beat him by 4.3 just in California. So does that make you concerned that, Joe Biden, he needs to outperform Hillary Clinton pretty handily if he's going to win that Electoral College map?
I mean, I think he can. I think he will. And I think, on the flip side of it, if you look at the raw numbers, there was less of a turnout across the entire country from 2016 compared to 2012. So as much as people look at the percentage, which is important because it's reflective of that day, that election, it's also important to look at the numbers. And the reality here in Wisconsin is Trump actually got less votes than Mitt Romney did in our state when Barack Obama beat him 4 years prior. So Romney got 1,407,000. Trump got 1,405,000. But that was enough to actually beat Clinton.
Your state, it was only by 0.77%. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, it was a small margin, about 40,000 votes. It was enough to get over Clinton. And every poll before that had Clinton up about 6%. And I've been telling people since after the election that if there was a redo 3 days after the election, it wouldn't have been close and Clinton would have won. I think it was just so many people thought, well, forget it, I'm not going to vote. I'm going to skip this election. And now we're finding out in the years since, in fact, there was a report out of the BBC just a week ago that there was purposeful efforts to suppress African-American votes in my city, in Milwaukee, to try and push them to vote. And, you don't have to convince a huge number enough to be able to overcome the margin, and that's what Trump was able to do.
Well, there was also the problem of Hillary Clinton not aggressively campaigning in Wisconsin after she won the nomination, which leads me perfectly into the next question. Staying with you, Chris, on this is the question of voter enthusiasm. And ABC News chief global correspondent Martha Raddatz, she just did a 6,000-mile cross-country tour, and she reported on this week, and she said that she did not see enthusiasm for Joe Biden as she was traveling across the country. Does that concern you, and especially now with COVID, that he can't get out there and glad hand and kiss babies and shake hands and do all that great stuff because of these now new health restrictions?
Yeah, I mean, it is. But at the same time, why do we have those restrictions? And it's because we have a botched response from our president, right? Where other countries, they're still able to actually go out and live somewhat relatively normal lives compared to what we're doing here. And I think a lot of people recognize that. And at the end of the day, this is a referendum on Trump, right? And that famous question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And so while there might not be some rabid enthusiasm for Joe Biden, there definitely is enthusiasm for getting Trump out of office. And that's one of the things that's really come out of this debate on Tuesday. I think that you would have raised a lot of money if you would have offered people if people could have paid to shut off Donald Trump's mic over the course of that debate. There's only one way to do that, and that is to vote him out of office. And so there is active and entire enthusiasm for getting that to happen. It's more of a choice. It answers the question that Trump had 4 years ago: what have you got to lose? Now we know, and I think that has locked people into their place where we have less than 7% undecided in our state now.
So what about that, Chris Sprowls? Is this a referendum on Donald Trump, or is it a choice between Joe Biden and the president?
Yeah, look, I think it's a choice, but here's the reality. There's no enthusiasm among the Democrat base for Joe Biden because they've known what he's done, or what I should say, what he hasn't done for 47 years. You know, Donald Trump's been in political office 3 years as president, and in that 3-year period of time, there's a significant record to talk about putting more money in the pocket of people, whether it's in Florida or Wisconsin, making sure people have options on where they go to school. For the first time, taking real steps in the modern era in peace in the Middle East. I mean, these are significant things. And I think that the contrast is the record of Donald Trump versus 47 years against Joe Biden. So I would push back on that. The reality is this isn't a referendum on the president. It's a referendum on the two records. And the reason that there's significant enthusiasm among President Trump supporters is because of the record of accomplishments he's had in a short period of time. And the reason that there's a lack of enthusiasm for Vice President Biden is because for 47 years, there really hasn't been much action. And I think as a result of that, there's not a lot of action and enthusiasm.
Well, I hear you articulating all of those points. And if I may say, much better than the president did Tuesday night because of all the interrupting and kind of going in there like the underdog turned junkyard dog. We see these incredible rallies for Donald Trump. When he was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and Chris Larson State, he drew a huge crowd, even though the Wisconsin governor didn't even want him there. We see, Donald Trump, he gets his people fired up, he gets them excited for him, and yet his approvals have stayed stuck in the mid-40s. Chris Sprowls, what do you say about that?
Well, look, the election is going to show what the approval ratings really are for the president. Now, where I'll agree, Amy, is I think that people, because of all the noise, whether that's the noise created by the media or noise created by the nature of an election cycle like we have in the United States, the reality is people aren't hearing about the things that I mentioned, the accomplishments that we're talking about. But understand that if you're part of the Jewish community here in Florida, you know that the president moved the embassy to Jerusalem and that there's been peace with the United Arab Emirates. If you are part of the Venezuelan community, you know the crackdown that the president has had on the Maduro regime in Venezuela. If you're part of the Cuban American community here in Florida, you know that they're locked in for the president because of his pushback on socialist agendas, because they know what happens here in the United States or in South America when that's happened. So I think when you start breaking it down by the individual people that these policies have impacted, that is why I have the confidence to say that the president's going to win here in Florida, because I'm seeing it play out for those communities and for their families.
So Chris Larson, the big question mark, the big sort of joker's card in all of this is the mail-in balloting. Mm-hmm. And I understand that Swiss voters are very used to this. And in fact, John Lott, he's a researcher, he found that for Swiss voters, they mostly mail in ballot or some vote online, and people don't really go to the polls as they used to in the past. But this is very Americans to be doing mail-in ballots in these large numbers, this huge volume. Are you at all worried, Chris, that it's going to overwhelm the system? There was just a piece in the Atlantic Monthly where they're concerned that we just don't have the infrastructure and the resources to be able to do this correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can, right? And the fact is that there's been absentee voting in the United States since the Civil War. This is something that people exercise. And in Wisconsin, we have a no excuse, which means you can request a ballot to be mailed to you, fill it out, and send it back, and it works relatively well. And I think it's arches to the goal of trying to be able to make it as convenient as possible for people to vote. Now, the problem comes where you have a president who is trying to throw baseless accusations and say that mail-in voting is somehow fraudulent, while at the same time encouraging people to vote by mail. And at the same time as he does that. So it throws some question about whether people should wait and put their lives at risk because of the pandemic to vote in person, or if they're going to be able to request it early. And our numbers show that there's a lot of enthusiasm for voting early by Democrats in the state of Wisconsin, whereas Republicans have not really exercised that. And they may end up coming back to bite Republicans in the state, especially given the heightened coronavirus numbers. So I think the system will be fine as long as those in the media, and sorry to throw you out there, Amy, understand that it is going to take a while to count all these ballots, right? In the state of Wisconsin, we, by law, you cannot start counting votes until the day of the election. And so while these ballots come in, they sit and they cannot be counted until that day. And because of lines and because of whatnot, that usually won't happen until after polls close. So we will not have a result in Wisconsin the day of the election. I don't think throughout the United States we won't for a week.
Me. No result election night in Wisconsin, swing state that's so crucial. Chris Sprowls in Florida. What are your feelings about the mail-in ballot issue, especially since you're in a state with such a large retiree population, an older population that might feel a bit hesitant or nervous about voting in person because of COVID?
Well, look, we're used to absentee ballot voting in Florida and have been for a really long time. Chris mentioned that there are some states who are cultured to this. Florida's been doing this robustly for 20 years. So I don't have any concerns about it. I think it's worth noting that President Trump himself is voting absentee ballot. He's a Florida resident and is voting absentee ballot in Florida.
But he's telling all his supporters to show up at the polls.
Well, I think there's a difference, right? If you're a state like Florida who's been doing this for 20 years, and you're a state who hasn't had 20 years and 2 decades of trial and error to make sure to get this right, we should all be concerned that states who haven't been doing this for as long as whether it's Wisconsin or Florida, might not do this right. We've seen elections happen. We've seen it be done badly. Chris raised the point of counting absentee ballots. And so let me give you a contrast. Here in the state of Florida, we say that you start counting ballots a week before the election day. So if our Swiss friends, for example, wanted to stay up and get on the internet and look at Florida election results around 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 30 minutes after the polls close, they will begin to see results come in. The first results that they're going to see are our counted absentee ballots and our early voting. So we're going to count absentee ballots very early in Florida. It's the first election results that we result. As Chris mentioned, there are other states who don't necessarily start counting for days and days after the election, which I think is more likely to cause significant problems for that. So while I don't have concerns in Florida, I do have concerns in other states who might not be used to doing this.
So I do want to get to some of our viewer questions that Patricia so kindly emailed to me. You'll have to give me a minute here because the type is so tiny on this spreadsheet. We have a question from Matthias Bopp, KPMG, and he asks, if there was a third choice from a more consensus-oriented party, i.e. not polarizing towards the extremes, what would be its chance of being elected? Chris Larson, you want to take a swing at that?
Zero.
Zero. Although that's awesome. He did very well. He got 18% of the vote in 1992.
Yeah, but that doesn't. Again, the way that our system works, it is a complex machine, and so therefore, if you don't get the majority of votes in any particular state, you don't get any votes in the Electoral College, and therefore you don't get any representation. So we have a weird system compared to the Swiss one, and it's always bonkers having conversations with international friends, especially those in government. The prize here in America for second place is the same as third place, fourth place, fifth place, or never running at all, which is nothing. And so the idea that a third party candidate would be able to come in and actually usurp the two parties until we have proportional representation or completely change and overhaul how representative government is elected here, the chances are and continue to be zero.
And it's even hard for insurgent candidates like Bernie Sanders, an independent who caucuses with Democrats, to take over the party. He gave it a good try in 2016, and now you could say he's even a bit of a kingmaker, but it's still pretty rigid. Chris Sprowls, I have a question here from Astrid Langer. She's a foreign correspondent for NZZ, which is, how decisive do you think will be the Latino vote in Florida this year? Compared to previous years?
Yeah, that's a great question, and Latinos and Hispanics are going to play a critical role here in Florida. And as I mentioned earlier, I think that the president is going to have a better night in 2020 among Hispanic voters, particularly in South Florida, than he did 4 years ago in 2016. because of the crackdown on the Maduro regime, because of the pushback on socialism. You go down into Miami-Dade County, which is, of course, a traditional Democrat county, and particularly in the Hispanic communities, there is a love for President Trump based on the policies that he's enacted and how those policies resonate in the community. So I think one thing that the Biden campaign, particularly in Florida, has been totally dismayed about is that President Trump continues to overperform, even in the polls that I think might not be reflective of what we're going to see on election day. President Trump is still overperforming with Hispanics, and I think it's going to continue. And I think it's going to be a kind of a surprising number on November 3rd.
And a question here from Christian Peltzer, Vice President of JP Morgan, and he wants to know the million-dollar question: should we be concerned that we might not have a peaceful transition of power following November 3rd? Chris Larson, how concerned are you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not only unprecedented, it's concerning, right? And this is where talking to a lot of people who are motivated to get out and vote, not just against Trump, but against the idea that we won't have a democracy any longer. This shouldn't even be a question.
How would it actually work? I mean, would Donald Trump just sit in the White House and refuse to leave, and in his bed eating fried chicken?
I mean, what it would, yeah, and I think what it would look like, and if if you're paying close attention, you can see the lines being drawn on this, where he's trying to, one of the reasons cited of why they want to shove through a Supreme Court nomination is so that it can help decide questions in the presidential election. Well, what questions would be asked in a presidential election? One of the questions that Trump is accusing is saying that mail-in votes are fraudulent, and he would like to stop counting as early as possible, stopping counting legitimately cast ballots. And because more Republicans are planning on voting on election day because of his baseless accusations of fraud for mail-in voting, it would stop the vote count, and there will probably be court cases. And if they make their way through, if those are allowed to work their way through, they could try stopping the vote, similar to what they did in Florida back in 2000, where they ended it and said, well, we can't figure out a result, we're just going to stop it where it is and try to move things forward. It wouldn't be something that happens in January. It would be something that happens in November. And the question is if the courts and if the system will allow for that to happen, or if the press will allow that to happen.
Well, I have a new gig. I'm a writer for HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher. I just started about a month and a half ago. It's wild, it's fun, it's a really great time. And he just did an editorial, a long monologue on Friday about his concerns that Donald Trump will refuse to leave. He's been saying this for, the last 2 or 3 years, I think even since Donald Trump was first elected. Chris Sprowls, do you think that this is a legitimate concern that Donald Trump may refuse to accept defeat?
No, I think it's just mass hysteria, which is, really kind of surrounds everything that the president says. I mean, there's always mass hysteria no matter what he talks about. I'll go back to one point, though. In 2000, we were, of course, the epicenter of the challenge in the presidential election here in Florida. And, if you recall, Al Gore conceded on election night to then President-elect George W. Bush. And it was the Democrats who then challenged the election to go to the Supreme Court, not the Republicans. So I think certainly the argument that we don't want to have a Supreme Court that is divided by number, 8 as opposed to 9, having an uneven number in the event that there's a challenge. The last time it was challenged in 2000 by the Democratic Party, it did go to the United States Supreme Court. There were 9 justices, and that was decided. So I think that's just smart governance. I don't think that that's anything radical. I do think what is radical is in the context of President Trump's judicial nominee to the United States Supreme Court. Democrats have said if he appoints that he's going to go then and stack the Supreme Court in the event that that Nancy Pelosi or the Democrats take back the Senate. That is a radical suggestion. Even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who suggested that back in the 40s, was overruled by members of his own Democratic Party who controlled the Congress because it was such a radical idea.
And it doesn't poll well, but Chris Sprowls, why won't Trump just say and reassure the public that yes, he would accept the election results, November 3rd or however many days it takes to arrive at them? Why does he keep it like a question mark? Is he just trying to stir people up?
Yeah, no, and I don't think he does. I mean, I think part of the challenge here is it's like the other night. They brought up They brought up white supremacists, and then people said, well, we didn't like what he said. The Trump campaign said, well, he meant to say stand down. The reality is the president has condemned, hatred, racism, both specifically and broadly, multiple times throughout the course of his presidency, very directly. And yet people decide to ignore it and make it seem like they had been asked the question for the very first time. So I go back to the point, I just use that as an illustration, Amy, that no matter what the president says, there's kind of this mass hysteria that exists predominantly in the Twitterverse and on Facebook that just isn't reality.
And I would say, Chris Larson, I interviewed James Carville for Developfolk. I write a weekly column there earlier this summer. And he said, if I could use Louisiana accent, I won't try, that Twitter does not reflect public opinion, and we should not be looking at social media to understand where the American people are. But on the other side, during Tuesday night's debate, former Vice President Joe Biden, he would not say definitively. In fact, he said, I will not say definitively whether or not he supports or opposes packing the Supreme Court or getting rid of the filibuster in the Senate, which serves to drive bipartisan consensus.
Yeah, and right now we're at an odd time where we had a vacancy in the Supreme Court 4 years ago. The Republicans decided to pull a new precedent and create a new precedent out of thin air, saying that it's too close to the election. Don't be ridiculous. It's February, for goodness sake. We can't end up voting on this. And then so they set that as a standard, and now here we are. It's October. Death occurred last month, and they're rushing as fast as they can to try and fill this seat, to the point where 70% plus of the American public is saying that that's not acceptable, right? That they should end up allowing the vacancy to be filled by the president.
Why won't former Vice President Biden say one way or the other? He supports adding more justices if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed, or he opposes or he supports getting rid of the filibuster so that legislation can be passed by 51 votes, basically Democratic control.
Yeah, I think I can't speak for Biden, but I can say for most of us, we're hopeful that Republicans don't ever trying to jam through something for the sake of an ideology to the Supreme Court. But there definitely will be repercussions. There'll be a loss in faith of the courts. I think they'll be seen more as politicians in robes than legitimate arbiters of neutral justice.
Would you support adding more justices to the Supreme Court if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed?
I think given where we are, we're continuing to push Senator Ron Johnson, who is our senator here, to make sure he stands by his word 4 years ago and doesn't move forward on a vote for a nominee until after the inauguration. So, and I think that is still to be determined. Frankly, there has not been a single hearing yet, and it seems kind of giving away the show or giving away the game. The people are already saying how they were going to vote before a nominee was even put forward, which again throws into question the neutrality of a justice. It's supposed to be based off of what their independent views of the courts are of the Constitution.
You would keep it on the table to add more justices if Coney Barrett is.
I think right now we're focusing on trying to prevent that seat from being filled and abiding by Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dying wish, that the seat be filled by the next president. I think that's not completely out of the picture yet.
So, Chris Larson, we have another question here from Alexander Saltzman. He is head BU Specialty Germany at Novartis, and he wants to know what can and should be done to reduce polarization in the United States, a lot of which people blame Trump for, frankly.
Yeah, I think voting Trump out will be a big help. I think as Joe Biden put it, we are weaker, sicker, poorer, more divided, and more violent than we ever have. And I would say that it is a consequence that we've seen from the very beginning of him taking office. We've seen a spike in hate crimes that has carried forward. The president's words have consequences, whether he says them on Twitter or he says them into a microphone. And that includes the increase in hate crimes by him refusing to condemn the Proud Boys, white supremacists, and pretending he doesn't know who David Duke is. That's exactly what they want to hear. And so I think we have to get to a point where we have a president who does have some sense of shame and recognizes their role as a moral leader, for many millions of people in our country. I think that'll help. The second big thing is getting money out of politics and changing the way that the system is run, because right now there is very little room in the middle because there is so much money of pushing things to the outer edge. Until that changes, I think it's going to continue to become more and more of an echo chamber. And the third thing is until the way social media changes, because we are in our own silos. And so it's a lot easier to stay on your side and get your likes without having to try and find a common ground in the middle. Those are three things that we could do.
So, Chris Sprowls, I have to imagine that you want to rebut some of those points.
I do. Thank you.
I can't believe he wouldn't agree with my first point.
Yeah, no. In fact, I'll push back robustly. I mean, look, if you look across the country and the places that are having those massive spikes in crime, Chicago, who's had an over 20% increase in violent crime rates, including having the most deadly weekend in 50 years in the city of Chicago of deaths by shooting. New York City, which is 20%, Philadelphia, 20% rise in violent crime. All of these locations have one thing in common, and that is their government is dominated by the Democratic Party. Their mayors are Democrat, their city councils are Democrat. Blaming President Trump for a spike in violence in Democrat-run cities is just not true and not based on fact. The reality is, and where I'll agree with Chris, is I do think that social media has infected our politics in a terrible way. I do think people are reactionary. But in order to change that, we actually have to say things based on fact and based on information and based on data. And I think one of the things that we can probably say is that in our higher education institutions, certainly we're not producing individuals who are prepared to engage in our political discourse. The diversity of thought in our higher education institutions has been diluted in a great significant way. For our Swiss friends, there's a great book out there called, The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt. And it's all about how we're producing individuals who are coming out of our higher education institutions really not prepared to engage in this back and forth kind of pluralism model that has made America great for so many years. So I think that needs to be a change. And I think addressing those issues and saying, hey, all diversity matters, but certainly in our higher education institutions, diversity of thought should be something that should be important in every single classroom.
Can we just bring millennials and Gen Z, their cancel culture, the cry bullies and the snowflakes?
Yeah.
I don't think that would be fair. But I want to ask you, Chris Larson, sometimes when I listen to this idea that America's, the discussion is more vitriolic than ever, Americans are more at each other's throats than they ever have been before. And, reflect back to elections 100 years ago where they called each other's names, where we had a duel on the Senate floor, or even more recently when I worked for Bill Frist when he was Senate Majority Leader, I was his speechwriter. And I remember these massive marches on the Mall against the Iraq War with posters of George Bush as Hitler and his vice president as Goebbels. So do you think some of this is kind of like, this imagining and this nostalgia for a past that really didn't happen?
We do have a violent history, whether we want to recognize it or not. We did have a civil war. But since then, we have gotten to a point where we assume that there are certain norms. You will not cross those lines. We're at a different time. In my home state of Wisconsin, we had a kid, 17, cross state lines to come in because there was a protest and decided to bring a assault rifle with him. He ended up shooting 3 protesters and killing 2 of them. This happened the day after the Republican National Convention highlighted 2 people in St. Louis who brought out their guns and showed them to protesters as a way to intimidate them. So they highlighted bringing people out to be able to have guns and to show protesters who's boss. The next day, you had this 17-year-old come out there and kill 2 people. It should have been universal to condemn that. But what's been really sad and frustrating is that he was brought up, his mother was brought up and celebrated at a Waukesha Republican Party event 2 weeks ago. And there is a private fund that has raised $500,000 for his legal defense. So it's not to the point where there's universal condemning of violence. There's actually a coddling of white supremacists and violent white supremacists at that. And that gets to be in a very dangerous place. So yes, we have a violent history, but frankly, the future and the future of our country as a democracy is the one that we make. And so it should be one where it shouldn't be based on party, that violence should be condemned, not accepted, and even just turning the other way, as the president did when he was asked to condemn white supremacists by saying, stand by. It sends a dangerous signal to some dangerous people that they may end up coming in and doing violent things.
Chris Sprowls and Donald Trump, the active Democrats, that he's ginning up violence from these bigoted groups.
Well, look, thank you for that. And I think, look, the easiest way to resolve this is when we get off the call, people who have that lingering question, Google videos of President Trump condemning racism, white supremacy. You're going to find videos of him doing it multiple times throughout the course of his 3 years in office, and then you can decide for yourself. So I think that's pretty easily solved. As far as the violence is concerned, again, it's like you can't pick and choose which violence, that upsets you and which violence doesn't. The reality is there's a massive movement in this country where we've had people from other states where we've been, Portland and Seattle have sent Antifa and agitators who are paid rioters, paid looters, paid agitators, where groups gather and then a car or a van comes by and drops off a pallet of bricks, where those bricks can be thrown through windows or at police officers. This is happening. And it's not happening because of conservatives. Neighborhoods have been destroyed. Police officers have been knocked out by bricks and dragged. So I think you're seeing that play out as an inflection point. But I go back to what I said earlier, which is this is mostly playing out in Democrat-run cities. It is not playing out in Republican states. It is not playing out strongly certainly in Republican cities. So I think that is going to be a referendum on the election. Is certainly how do we handle rioting and looting? Everyone agrees. Chris and I will agree. Part of America, the tenet of American democracy is saying, hey, you should protest, you should make your voices heard. But neither of us, I think, would ever agree that violence is a way to do that. That destruction of a neighborhood or destruction of someone's property is the ability to do that. So I think that this election is going to give people the choice between a Republican agenda led by President Trump, where it's going to be very clear that that our police officers and our law enforcement community are going to be empowered, and Joe Biden, who refused to acknowledge that Antifa was even a real organization the other night.
Before we go, one last question, Patricia. I'm just going to squeeze it in. Are you optimistic about our country and our future? I have to say that I am. Every 4 years, we're told it's a battle for the soul of America, the most important election of our lifetimes. We hear it every 4 years. I actually have a lot of faith in our country that we're going to keep moving forward and finding ways to cooperate. Chris Larson, your last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question of where we go from here. But I think it is when the things that we love and we care about that we had taken for granted are put at risk or are at the risk of being lost forever, the people stand up and fight back and are willing to work. And I think there's a new era of activists who are looking and figuring out our democracy, how to run for office, how to get engaged, and how to actually make a difference. Those people don't go away on November 3rd, and I look forward to serving alongside them for years to come. There's a constant refresh button with the next generation as it comes along. So that leaves for infinite possibilities.
Right?
Yeah.
Chris Sprowls, your last thoughts. Are you optimistic for our country?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic for our country. I think that we're certainly at an inflection point, but I believe in this American experiment and our way of life here. I believe that school choice that has really taken hold in many pockets of the United States is going to allow children to get the education that they need and really start to learn true civics and true civic engagement. And while this is a tough period in our history, I believe America is going to be stronger than ever before in the near future.
Well, thank you, Chris Larson, Chris Sprowls. Thank you, Swiss viewers, the American Swiss Foundation, Patricia, Bob. I hope everyone found it an interesting, illuminating, and informative conversation, and maybe a little bit more than we saw Tuesday night, but hopefully we will see in the next presidential debate coming up. Thank you.
Good for you, Amy, for moderating a wonderful conversation. I would say it was heated and it was polarized, but it was respectful.
Really?
And that is by
CNN.
We saw some emotion, and that's good, and that's how it should be, and it should be a respectful and dignified discussion after all. So I think you certainly achieved your goal. Thank you so much to both of our panelists and our moderator for sharing so much of your time with us. I hope all of our viewers enjoyed this program, and I'd like to express my gratitude, especially to the sponsors and members of the American Swiss Foundation who make all of our programs possible. If you are interested in learning more about membership, please let me know or visit our website, americanswiss.org. With this, we conclude our program. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day.